There's a saying you may have heard once before, first impressions are lasting impressions, which is a reference to the primacy effect, wherein the first thing you learn about something carries the most significance as it effectively lays the foundation for any subsequent information that comes after and creates a subconscious bias towards it. That is why people emphatically stress the importance of making a good first impression, because doing so will make life a lot easier, including and especially when it comes to the video game industry. In a similar fashion, Wuthering Waves had a rocky first start. The game ran into a lot of issues upon release, with a large number of players either being straight up unable to log into the game or dealing with crashes and game-breaking bugs preventing them from advancing forward. There were also some who were having trouble running the game due to the overwhelming system requirements expected by it, which proved to be challenging to maintain even for high-end computers. That alongside the somewhat milquetoast content selection we had during the first couple months of the game, and unsurprisingly, players had a rather deflated first impression of WoWA. You can even see it among reviews as well, being one of the overarching criticisms aimed at the game. A lot of the early reviews on WoWA that you see on Metacritic and whatnot were quick to cast aspersions on the many headwinds the game ran into, and I'd hazard a guess that everyday gamers took those reviews to heart. Not that I blame them per se, the first month reviews were right to call out the many shortcomings WoWA had. But as someone who played the game since the day it came out and even played it during both the early access and closed beta test, I saw Wuthering Waves at its worst and at its best. While gacha games can and have on many occasions opened up bad and continue to be bad, players, not just the Kuroshils, but most people who play the game generally look to be in agreement that WoW has been getting better with each passing version. Mind you, I'm not implying the game doesn't have any major problems, there's still a couple, but if we compare how it is now to what it was when it first came out, it is unequivocally a massive change. So having thought about this for a while, I was curious and decided to go back and look at those first impressions to see if they still hold true today or if the game is in a vastly different state than it was before. I'm basically going to critique the critics, looking through some early reviews and giving my thoughts on how well they've aged. Is Wuthering Waves deserving of a re-evaluation the same way games like No Man's Sky and Final Fantasy XIV turned things around from their failures, or had they not improved enough to merit a higher score? Honestly, I had this idea in the back of my mind for a while and wasn't sure how well it would be received on account of it not being my usual content, but at this point screw it, can't knock it till you try it. Okay, right off the bat I want to establish that I have no personal grievances towards any of the people whose reviews I'll be reviewing. This is mostly meant to address the review itself, and not try to personally roast or attack the people who wrote them. First major point I found across multiple review platforms was their criticism towards the plot of Wuthering Waves. One of the biggest things people complained about, both critics and players alike, was the poor execution of the very story-related things, not the least of which being the controversial English voice acting. Many of the game's English voice actors were actually just that, English voice actors, like British, and yet many of them were forced to speak in an artificial American accent, making it difficult for them to convey their emotions properly, and even for those who didn't have an accent, listening to the game in English was, it was challenging to say the least. From that perspective, I think Kuro realized it would be better if voice actors could speak in their own comfort. Starting with the likes of Shorekeeper and then going well into version 2, speaking for myself, I actually find the characters to be much more charming in their own native accent. Not only does it make sense on account of Renacida being clearly inspired by Italy, or I suppose the greater Europe area, but it's honestly refreshing to hear so many different voices, especially during the Midnight podcast. It's basically ASMR. And I appreciate Kuro's willingness to allow these types of accents, instead of making everything just American. I happen to notice the fanbase in particular very much enjoys the more heavy European accents like that on Zani and Augusta. Definitely a welcome departure from the usual voice acting direction most games take. Second thing a lot of reviews took issue with is the early story, namely how dull and exposition heavy it was. One of the first high-profile quality of life features they added to WoWA was the option to skip cutscenes, and while I'm sure most of the people demanding this were players who didn't care about the story and just wanted to play, as someone who enjoys a good story once in a while, I really couldn't find myself getting attached to anything in the 1.0 main quest. From the massive amounts of exposition dumping to the aforementioned voice acting to just not really anything of noteworthy import happening to noteworthy characters, even the whole thing with Scar in the early points of the game did very little to entertain me and just about everyone. It wasn't until I would say Black Shores in 1.3 when the story finally started to get better and real shit started to actually happen. From that point onward, the game began to take a more individual approach to storytelling. It still plays into the grand plot of how Rover's the amnestic chosen one, but focusing on each new character that joins the game in their respective versions. Version 2 took this all the way too, with every character having their own major involvement in the story, from Carlotta to Phoebe to Cantarella to Cardadia to Lupa to Frolova to Augusta and so on. More importantly is that they've done a better job connecting the story to the actual world itself. A lot of open world games make the mistake of the story happening separately from the world itself, whereas throughout most of Renacida, Septimont and whatnot, As you progress through the story, you progress through the world, which helps to better connect you with the characters you're interacting with. On that note, I think another part of the game that's really gotten better is the cutscene presentation. Ordinarily, in other games, when you see cutscenes, the NPCs and characters are all just doing basic universal animations, only really doing custom or more elaborate movements and stuff during cinematics. But in WUA, and a lot of people pointed this out on Twitter and whatnot, the characters are way more expressive, almost as if every single cutscene is a cinematic shot, you know what I mean? Like even just basic talking dialogue, it's not the same hand wave or head shake you see every character make, you find a much wider assortment of movement and gestures. The difference between cutscenes and cinematics now compared to back in version 1.0 is like practically night and day. It makes the story more enjoyable to play through in my opinion. However, I will continue to point out just how seriously information heavy the game is. Not necessarily a bad thing, it's just that WoW is one of those games where you really have to pay attention to appreciate the story, especially with how connected everything is with each other. So if you're looking for a more straightforward plot and can't be bothered to learn a million different terms, the game's only gotten more sophisticated in that regard. That being said, their execution on that has gotten a lot better. The world building has improved a good bit and the characters feel more meaningful to the game. Next major gripe I saw across most reviewers were the glaring technical issues when the game came out, namely in how poorly the game was running and how technically demanding the game is computer specs wise and such. This one's kind of subjective I would say, and it comes down to your experience. On one hand, yes, the game is extremely performance demanding, far more than what the average player can handle, and there have been several accounts of people having issues running the game on older computers and mobile devices. The early days of WoA were especially guilty of that, with said performance issues making it hard to run the game at higher graphics. Since then, things have become more optimized in that regard, and WoA's ability to be run at 120 FPS makes the game feel really smooth to play. Some newer areas can still be tough on weaker devices, but it's only due to them being so much bigger and more vast in scale. Like if you were to compare Huanglong with Septimont, the sheer amount of extra detail and stuff they added is like comparing WoA to Minecraft. One more thing I noticed, especially in the IGN review, that I remember complaining about myself back in the day was how the game's attributes kind of fell flat. Namely in that there's no real differentiation between them, highlighting how for example fire doesn't burn enemies over time or ice doesn't freeze them. They talked about how a unit could be fusion, havoc, or arrow for all the difference it made, or lack thereof. I'm gonna have to agree on that. Up until version 2 there really was no difference between attributes, merely the type of damage it did when factoring enemy resistances. There were no systems in place to properly distinguish a spectral character from a glacial one. To some extent there still isn't. Although one thing that has become more noticeable in recent years are the mono-element teams like Mono Spectral, Mono Fusion, and Mono Havoc to name a few. Extending beyond that, we now have element-specific damage over time debuffs like Spectral Frazzle, Glacial Shaft, Fusion Burst, Havoc Bane, Arrow Erosion, and Electro Flare, although I don't think they're all damage over time. It might just be case-by-case basis. In any case, they give proper incentives to put units of a certain element together. Ultimately, the 6 attributes are all just there to do damage of their respective types, but Kuro has taken steps to make elements more unique, both in characters and systems. Another somewhat controversial part of WoA's gameplay system was echoes, which, while many people often complain about the tedium of grinding and leveling echoes, is, in my opinion, one of the best implementations of a gacha equipment system. They allowed it to harmonize with the open world by giving us the freedom to limitlessly farm echoes as much as we wanted, and also allowed us to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You could progress your account while completing a world exploration, although the novelty kind of wears off after the first couple times. In that regard, I think echo farming is still kind of tedious in how frustrating it is to get a good echo no matter how many of them you try to level up. I have upgraded thousands by this point and some of my characters don't have a completed set yet, although granted I am aiming for 4 out of 5 or 5 out of 5, so I might just be setting the bar too high. Being aware of this, Kuro has added a few things to make echo farming more convenient while still giving players the option to farm echoes the old-fashioned way. For one, Nightmare Purification, I think it's a great addition to the game. You can fight clusters of enemies all belonging to the same echo set in a tight circle once per day at no cost to your wayplates, giving you an easy spot to farm a handful of echoes every single day. They started doing this when they brought in the 3-piece echo sets, which I very much appreciate. Fantasy 1000 Gateways is also a good way to collect echoes of any set you want for later. So while technically the monotony of echo farming hasn't really gotten much better, there are now more ways to farm echoes that you don't have to put in the same amount of grinding hours you had to back in 1.0. All in all, in virtually every aspect that reviews talked about during the early days of WoA, Kuro has made improvements on. Again, I'm not saying the game solved all of them, but I said this before and I'll say it again. Their rate of improvement is what makes me optimistic towards the future of their game. Wuthering Waves has only been out for just over a year, and so much has been worked on since then. Story's gotten better, quality of life has gotten better, graphics have gotten better, albeit more demanding. Combat has gotten more exciting, endgame has been expanded on, voice acting has gotten better, events have gotten better. I especially enjoyed the Banners Never Fall event. nearly every major thing has gotten better. So kinda circling back to the original question of are day 1 reviews outdated? Most definitely. To be fair, they were relatively accurate for the time they came out, but just like No Man's Sky or Final Fantasy XIV, I think game critics should make an effort to check out games again because like I said, Wuthering Waves has shown a commitment to improving itself. That's something you don't see in many other gachas. They only fix things when players complain or review bomb the game, but I feel like WUA is one of the few gachas out there that unironically pays attention to the surveys they ask you to do. It's not just an opinion I have alone either. RPG Fan actually decided to check the game out in July of this year, roughly a year and change after the game came out, and they definitely had much better things to say about the game overall. From what I'm able to gather based on looking at the review, the person who wrote it must have definitely been keeping up with the game back when it first came out, because they're aware of, for example, the fact that being able to change the main stats on echoes before leveling them was something not available during the initial release. Or how they evaluated 1.0's Jinzhou in contrast with 2.0's Renacida. They even went as far as to point out the game's rocky launch and plethora of issues I talked about earlier, not the least of which being the forced American accents. The following paragraph then went on to point out how Kuro went on to go back and re-record some lines. So evidently the improvements made to the game have not gone unnoticed, and the higher rating is, in my opinion, a more appropriate evaluation of the game than before. Just to repeat, it's not perfect, WUA can still get a lot better, and low-key I wish they released it like an MMO instead of a gacha game, but that aside, I do think everyone, both game critics and players who wrote this off back in 2024 should make an effort to give the game a second look. It is exceedingly rare for a gacha game to change this much in a short time. Gacha games that start out poorly seldom if ever make as big of an effort to improve the way Wuthering Waves has. With all that being said, I'd like to ask you guys, do you think WUA has changed a lot since version 1.0, or do you think I'm exaggerating on how much they actually improved on? And on that note, do you think there is a part of the game that is yet to see any upgrades? You're welcome to share them in the comments down below. That's it for today, so if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you'd like to like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter @FarsRam, join my Discord server, and check out my other Wuthering Waves discussion videos if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.